That October Tuesday would change everything. But at that moment, as Hargrove Semiconductor Solutions' freight elevator groaned its way up to the third floor, nobody in the factory, not even Marcus Oliver, imagined what was about to happen. Hargrove occupied a 150,000 square foot industrial warehouse in a sprawling industrial park in Ohio. From the outside, it looked modest. Inside, it was the kind of place that exuded an aura of quiet wealth. Air conditioning set to an exact 66 degrees Fahrenheit, epoxy floors that reflected the LED fixtures like a mirror, machines that cost more than most of the homes in the surrounding neighborhood. It was a company that had built its reputation on the idea that precision was non-negotiable, and that this idea applied equally to the people it hired. There was an unwritten hierarchy at Hargrove, as rigid as the calibration parameters of its equipment. White lab coats for senior engineers, gray for technicians, and orange badges for the interns, the temporaries, those who were there by tolerance, not by belonging. Two names from the gallery that moved along that corridor: Fabio Miller, a 38-year-old senior engineer, quiet, methodical, with 11 years at the company and eyes that observed more than his mouth spoke, and Claudia Fisher, the CEO's 44-year-old personal assistant, efficient as an algorithm, who had learned that surviving there meant disappearing at the wrong moments. Marcus Oliver was 24, wore an orange badge, and carried a worn black canvas backpack as if it were a second spine. Tall, lean, with untamed natural hair, his eyes took a second longer than normal to process his surroundings, not from slowness, but from the kind of attention that identifies what others miss. He entered the third floor with the unhurried stride of someone who owed explanations to no one, looked at the paralyzed industrial printer in the center of the room, 6.5 feet tall, brushed aluminum panels, digital display blinking red, and slowly placed his backpack on the floor. It was the first day he would need to prove he belonged there. What Richard Hargrove didn't know was that Marcus Oliver had already decided years before that he would never again need to prove anything to anyone, and that this decision, paradoxically, was what made him impossible to defeat. Richard Hargrove entered the room with the stride of someone who owned the ground he walked on. 58 years old, 6 feet 1 inch tall, his gray hair combed with the precision of someone who tolerated no imperfection, not even in the mirror. His tailored navy suit was the same as always. He had 4 identical ones, commissioned from Milan, because he saw no reason to vary what worked. Richard had built Hargrove from scratch in 3 decades, and in the process had developed a talent he called leadership instinct, the ability to identify in seconds who had value. It was a simple theory, almost elegant in its brutality. People who arrived with the right clothes, the right diplomas, the right vocabulary, these were worth the investment. The others were spare parts. When he saw Marcus kneeling before the machine with a simple screwdriver and a headlamp, Richard Hargrove couldn't suppress a laugh. It was an open, long, theatrical laugh, the kind he made sure everyone heard. "Kid," Richard said, with the condescension of someone who thinks they're being kind by clarifying the obvious, "this machine has a quantum calibration system that even my engineers with 15 years' experience haven't been able to solve. You won't be able to." Marcus didn't look up. He continued examining the side panel with the absolute calm of someone who hadn't heard, or who had heard and decided the remark wasn't worth a response. "I'm talking to you," Richard said louder. His smile tightened. "I heard you, Mr. Hargrove." Marcus's voice was low, without a trace of harshness. "I'm just finishing my analysis before I respond." The room held its breath. Richard looked at those present as if seeking confirmation that there were witnesses to this. There were Paul Sanders, 50, Director of Operations, a man with a gray mustache and a permanently cautious expression; Fabio Miller, the senior engineer in the white lab coat who had spent 11 hours trying to identify the problem; Renata Collins, process engineer, 33, who crossed her arms the moment Richard laughed; Theo Lewis, maintenance technician, 28, who pretended to consult his tablet when the laughter rang out; Claudia Fisher, the assistant, who typed something on her phone with unusual speed; and 2 new assembly line technicians, Edward and Scott, who had come up to follow the diagnosis and exchanged a quick glance when the CEO's laugh echoed through the warehouse. "Someone call Siemens," Richard declared, without taking his eyes off Marcus. "We need their specialized technician. This kid's only going to make it worse." The Greek chorus reacted in various ways. Renata turned her face to the window, jaw clenched. Theo lowered his tablet even further. Edward and Scott remained motionless. Fabio, only Fabio, took an involuntary step towards Marcus, as if his body knew what loyalty had not yet authorized. "May I ask how long the machine has been down?" Marcus said, still without looking up. 52 hours, Paul Sanders replied, before Richard could intervene. "Estimated loss?" $320,000 in delayed contracts, Paul said, and there was something in his voice, a tense restraint like a stretched elastic band at its breaking point. Marcus nodded slowly. "So, may I continue?" Richard opened his lips to reply. Marcus had already turned back to the panel. The young man's calm produced an effect the CEO couldn't quite name. It was like trying to argue with a wall that politely agreed with everything and then did exactly what it had planned. Annoying in a way that didn't fit into any known category of irritation. Richard stepped away to call Siemens, convinced that in 10 minutes everyone would see the intern politely replaced. What he didn't know was that in 8 minutes the 52-hour problem would be solved. Fabio approached the young man while the others waited. "What are you looking for?" he whispered. "The piezoelectric sensor on the Z-axis has a 0.03 millimeter misalignment," Marcus responded, also quietly, with the naturalness of someone stating the time. "The noise the machine makes changes frequency every 7 cycles. It's the exact thermal expansion interval for this model when the sensor fails." Fabio stood still for 3 seconds, the time it took to understand that 11 hours and an orange-badged intern had reached the same conclusion in 8 minutes. A seed of shame, small and warm, bloomed somewhere behind his sternum. The smell of hot metal from the open panel was identical to the smell of Old Man Adam's workshop in the old neighborhood. Marcus closed his eyes for half a second, just half a second, and the present folded back like a page. He was 11 when he first entered that tiny 32-square-foot workshop on the second floor of a mustard-yellow duplex. Old Man Adam fixed radios, televisions, anything with a circuit board and wires. He charged little, earned little, but knew the name of every component of every device that crossed his bench. Marcus would sit for hours on a small wooden stool, watching the old man's hands identify faults by touch, by smell, by ear. He never needed a manual. "Electronics don't lie," Old Man Adam would say. "Everything that breaks gives a warning first. You just have to learn to listen." Connie did laundry for others 5 days a week, returning with red hands and still sang while preparing dinner. Mr. Darius hauled construction materials in the pre-dawn hours, and he used to study with Marcus at night, sitting at the same table, each with their notebooks. There was no money for English classes, no outings, no extracurricular experiences of the kind that would appear on the resumes of candidates who competed with Marcus years later. There was only that table, that lamp, those 2 worn-down pencils, and the unspoken certainty, passed from father to son, that attention cost nothing and was worth everything. At 19, Marcus bought an utterly defunct graphics processing server for $80 at a flea market in Queens. It took him 3 weeks to dismantle it, map out every flaw, and order individual parts with the money he'd saved penny by penny for months. When the server was working again, he sold it for $4,200. The money paid for his university prep course. His acceptance into the electrical engineering program at Georgia Tech was the first thing that made Mrs. Conchison cry tears of joy, not relief, but pure joy, the kind of joy that needs no words. The day the results came out, Marcus stared at his phone screen for 10 minutes before he could speak. He had decided at that moment, not as a rhetorical promise but as a definitive fact about himself, that he would never again let anyone define his worth. That dignity was not something earned from others' approval. It was something carried within. The present moment returned with the scent of air conditioning and metal. A few feet away, Richard Hargrove was on the phone with Siemens, and as he spoke, something ancient stirred in the depths of his memory. Something he had learned not to recognize. Richard was 42 when his eldest son, Daniel, then 16, failed his college entrance exam for the first time. It hadn't been a serious failure. It was a difficult exam. The boy was intelligent. He would try again. But Richard had remained silent throughout dinner that night. A silence Daniel felt in his body like a palpable chill. Richard never said anything about that failure. He didn't need to. The silence was the message. The same silence Richard's own father had used for decades to communicate disappointment, to assess worth, to establish that love was conditional, and the condition was performance. Richard had grown up in that silence. He had learned that showing vulnerability was the same as exposing one's jugular, and he had, without realizing it, reproduced the system with such fidelity that he no longer knew there was another way to operate. The arrogance he displayed wasn't confidence. It was armor. The laugh he let out upon seeing Marcus kneeling, that long, theatrical guffaw, was the same laugh his father had responded with when Richard, at 22, presented his first circuit prototype. "That'll never work, son." The prototype had worked. Richard had treasured the silence that followed his father's approval. Brief, dry, devoid of praise, as if it were gold. He never questioned the price he had paid to earn that silence, and he never realized that he had become exactly the man who had shaped him. Back in the present, Richard hung up the phone with Siemens and walked back into the room. What he found stopped him in his tracks. The three senior engineers stood in a semicircle, in silence. The machine had powered on. The digital display showed calibration, 100%. System operational. Richard Hargrove stopped at the doorway as if the floor had changed texture beneath his feet. Fabio had his hands in his pockets, looking at the display with an expression that wasn't astonishment. It was late, painful recognition. Renata Coelho had uncrossed her arms. Paulo Sergio looked at the intern with the orange badge with the expression of someone who had just watched an equation solve itself. Marcus stood up, wiped his hands on the rag he'd pulled from his backpack, and said, to the room, not specifically to the CEO, "You can test the full cycle. The sensor has been repositioned within the 0.001 millimeter tolerance margin. It shouldn't repeat." Fabio clapped. It was involuntary, genuine, the kind of applause the body gives before the mind decides if it's appropriate. Richard looked at the orange badge as if expecting the plastic to explain something logic couldn't grasp. Then he regained his composure, a reflex of decades, and said, with a strained nonchalance that fooled no one, "Beginner's luck. Sometimes the most obvious solution is the one specialists ignore precisely because they are specialists." It was Claudia who spoke, before she could stop herself. "Richard." Her voice was low but firm, the kind of firmness that comes at a cost. "He didn't get lucky. I heard what he told Fabio. He identified the failure pattern by the cycle's noise." The CEO looked at his assistant. There was something in Claudia at that moment, a straightness in her gaze he hadn't seen in 11 years of working together. She averted her gaze from his and returned to her tablet, but the gesture was already made. It had cost her something, and she knew it. Marcus carefully closed his backpack. He checked each clasp. He put the tools back exactly where he'd taken them from. Tweezers, multimeter, set of wrenches. The warehouse breathed around him. Outside, machines continued their rhythm. Inside the room, the silence had its own texture, dense, slightly nauseating, like air before a storm. It was then that the door opened and Dr. James Okafor entered, a man of 62, Nigerian, 1.78 meters tall, whose presence transcended his height. He wore an earthy brown suit, no tie, thick-rimmed glasses, and took slow, deliberate steps, like someone who doesn't need to rush before being ready. Dr. Okafor was a professor emeritus at MIT, the foremost living authority on industrial piezoelectric systems, and had been hired by Hargrove for $180,000 to solve precisely the problem Marcus had resolved in 8 minutes. He saw Marcus, stopped, and the smile that spread across his face was that of someone who unexpectedly finds something precious they had lost sight of. "Marcus!" The voice boomed through the warehouse like a declaration. "I thought you weren't arriving until next week." He walked up to the young man with the unequivocal familiarity of someone embracing a person they admire. Eduardo and Sandro exchanged glances. Tiago looked up from his tablet for the first time in 20 minutes. Dr. Okafor turned to the room with the natural ease of someone accustomed to occupying space without asking permission. "Gentlemen and madam," he said, with a nod to Renata, "this young man was my most brilliant student in the last 20 years of my career." Pause. "I published a paper with him on piezoelectric failures in high-temperature environments. He was 23. The paper is being adopted by Siemens, Bosch, and Samsung as a standard diagnostic protocol." Another pause. Calculated, like a professor who knows the weight of silence. "How old are you now, Marcus?" 24, Professor. 24, Dr. Okafor repeated, and then looked directly, unhurriedly, at Richard Hargrove. The CEO felt the blood drain from his face, not with a sudden jolt, but like a receding tide, slow, irresistible, leaving the sand exposed. The gallery reacted in waves. Renata let out a sigh that wasn't a sigh. It was the release of something held back. Fabio closed his eyes for 3 seconds, and when he opened them, there was a decision in them that hadn't been there before. Paolo Sergio let his arm drop, an arm he had kept crossed since the beginning. Tiago, Eduardo, and Sandro stood completely still. The kind of stillness that indicates the nervous system is processing more than it can verbalize. Claudia looked at her tablet, then at Marcus, then back at the tablet, as if needing a third point to triangulate what she had just understood. "How many times has the paper been cited?" Paolo Sergio asked, in a low voice. 340, Dr. Okafor replied. "Last I checked." Richard opened his mouth, closed it. There was something about the number that unsettled him beyond the obvious. 340 was the same valuation, in millions of dollars, as his own company, as if the universe had made an unprompted comparison. It was then that Claudia, the assistant, stepped forward. The straight line in her gaze had returned, now sharper. "Richard." Her voice was low, but without a tremor. 2 weeks ago, we received an email from Samsung at the company's general address. It was for one of our associates. She took a breath. I filed it as spam because the sender was a public university address. I didn't open it properly. A pause. I just checked. It was for Marcus. Samsung was offering $420,000 annually, plus participation in research and development. The silence that settled was the kind with physical weight, the kind you feel in your chest, like pressure. He didn't respond, Claudia continued, and there was something close to astonishment in her voice, because he was waiting to finish his internship, out of respect for the commitment he had made. Richard Hargrove looked at Marcus Hayes. For the first time that morning, perhaps for the first time in many years, the CEO looked at someone without calculating what that person could yield. He just looked, and deep within something that had been buried by decades of armor, he recognized it. Not talent, but character. The same kind of character he himself had buried so deeply he no longer knew where he'd put it. It was just a flicker. Richard suppressed it instantly. But the room had seen, Fabio had seen, and that half-second of involuntary recognition would make what came next possible. "There's one more thing," Marcus said. His voice was calm. There was no triumph in it, no anger. It was simply the voice of someone who had information and thought it was time to share it. He opened his backpack and took out a thin, clear plastic folder. He extracted 3 stapled sheets and placed them on the nearest counter. He didn't hand them to anyone, just set them there, available like someone leaving a tool on a workbench. Paul Davies was the first to approach. He read the first line, looked up at Marcus, read it again. "What is this?" Richard asked, with a calm that cost visible effort. "It's the proposal Professor Okafor brought for the company," Marcus said. "The one for the $180,000 consultancy." A pause. "And the alternative proposal I had drafted for the same problem 3 weeks ago when we first identified the failure pattern during my internship routine." A second pause. "I submitted it to my internship supervisor, Mr. Paul Davies, by email, with a copy to HR." Paul Davies closed his eyes. When he opened them, there was something close to shame, honest, undisguised shame. The email stayed in the review queue. It never reached Richard. He looked at the CEO. By protocol, technical proposals from interns need senior validation before reaching the board. None of the senior engineers prioritized reading it. Fabio said nothing, but his body said everything. His shoulders dropped 2 centimeters and didn't come back up. Richard Hargrove walked to the counter. He picked up the 3 sheets, read them. With each line, something shifted in the CEO's face. Not dramatically, but with the irreversibility of a tide. The diagnosis was identical to what Marcus had demonstrated that morning. The solution was identical. The email's date was 22 days prior. "Did you know the professor was coming?" Richard asked, without lifting his eyes from the sheets. "I knew the company had hired an external consultancy for the problem," Marcus said. "I didn't know it was Professor Okafor specifically. I found out when he walked through the door. Richard finally lifted his face. The 58-year-old CEO, 3 decades with the company, a $340 million valuation, suddenly looked like a man who had reached the top of a long ladder and found on the last rung someone who had taken a different path and arrived at the same place, earlier carrying less. "You laughed at me," Marcus said. His voice remained calm, in front of everyone, before knowing anything about me, what I knew, what I had done, who I was. A pause. That wasn't an error in judgment, it was a choice. The room was so silent you could hear the air conditioning system. "You're right," Richard said. His voice came out strange, like a muscle that hadn't been used in a long time. "You're right." "Then I have a request," Marcus said. "Not for myself." "Tell me." "Your internship program doesn't accept students from public universities in less prominent regions, only from private universities in major economic centers." Marcus looked at Paul Davies, then back at Richard. "There are brilliant people who will never get a chance to walk through this door because of that rule. People who solve problems in 8 minutes that cost $180,000 in consultancy, and who wouldn't even know this door exists." A pause. "That needs to change." Richard stood still. Fabio in the background had crossed his arms, but it was a different kind of arm crossing than Renata's earlier that morning. It was the arm crossing of someone determined to bear witness, not to protect themselves. "Paul," Richard said, without taking his eyes off Marcus. "I'm already drafting it," Paul Davies replied, who had opened his tablet 20 seconds earlier, without needing authorization, without needing a signal. He had waited years for a reason strong enough to propose that change without it seeming presumptuous. Now the reason was in front of everyone, wearing an orange ID badge with a thin folder of 3 stapled sheets. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has texture, like earth after rain, dense and fertile. Marcus declined Hargrove's immediate full-time offer. Politely, with the discreet smile of someone who no longer needs to prove anything. "Samsung was generous," he said, "and I made a commitment to them as well." Before leaving, he opened his backpack one last time and left a black-covered notebook on the counter. 40 pages, small, firm handwriting, diagrams and pen. "For Fabio," he said, without drama. "So you won't need 180,000 next time." Fabio took a moment to extend his hand. When he did, Marcus shook it firmly, eye to eye, without resentment, without performance. Just 2 engineers recognizing each other's work. Claudia accompanied him to the elevator. In the hallway away from the others, she said quietly, "I should have opened that email. I'm sorry." Marcus looked at her. "You spoke up when it mattered," he replied. "That's enough." Claudia nodded, but the phrase stayed with her for weeks, the good weight of a responsibility fulfilled in time. 8 months later, Hargrove Semiconductor had completely revamped its internship program. The policy change, drafted by Paul Davies that same afternoon, signed by Richard by the end of the day, opened applications to students from public universities in 14 states. Fabio Miller was appointed technical coordinator of the new program, a role created specifically for him, recognizing what he had tried to do that morning before he had enough courage. The first cohort included 23 interns. One of them, Yasmin, 21 years old from Boise, Idaho, solved an energy efficiency problem in her first week that had cost $60,000 in external consulting. When Paul Davies told Richard this in a results meeting, the CEO remained silent for almost 10 seconds. The same silence he had used it had taken a lifetime to communicate disappointment. This time, it sounded different. It sounded like learning. Richard Hargrove recounted the story of the orange badge at a leadership conference 6 months later. His voice cracked mid-speech. Once, just once, but the auditorium of 400 people heard it. "I learned," he said, "that talent doesn't wear the same badge every day. Sometimes it wears the orange one." It wasn't absolution. It wasn't complete redemption. It was a man who had looked inward and found the cost of what he had built, and who had decided, belatedly but with determination, to pay part of the debt. At Samsung, Marcus published his second article with Dr. Okafor, this time on energy efficiency in next-generation semiconductors. The first page bore, in the acknowledgments, 2 names, Mrs. Eleanor and Mr. David. The true winners aren't those who reach the top. They're those who change what it means to be there.